Good afternoon and welcome. I'm David Feist, and I will be the facilitator of the webinar today. Our presenter is Keith Mowry. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on the revision of ISO IEC 17067 Guidelines for Product Certification Schemes. Please note we are recording this webinar so that it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box, question and answer box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions asked. Now let's tell you a little bit about the presenter. Keith Mowry is a Senior Manager of Business Development at ANAB. He is ANAB's representative on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, ICAC, the U.S. National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. He served as ICAC chair for over 20 years and has over 30 years experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Keith.
Thanks so much, David. Hi, everybody. I'm looking forward to discussing the 17067 revision with you. So what is 17067? Well, it's one of the ISO IEC 17000 series standards on conformity assessment. This group of standards, the 17000 series, is often referred to as the CASCO toolbox, because CASCO is the committee in ISO that's responsible for the standards. Many of the standards in this series are co-branded with IEC, which means they are just as much an IEC standard as they are an ISO standard, and that's the case with 17067. So 17067 is an example of an international standard that provides guidance as opposed to requirements. Specifically, it provides guidance for product, process, and service certification schemes. What's a scheme? Well, a scheme is really just a set of rules and procedures for how to perform conformity assessment. In this case, how to perform product, process, or service certification. Those rules and procedures, or the information, they do three things. They describe the kind of product, process, or service to be certified. They identify the requirements that a product, process, or service must meet in order to be certified. And I think most importantly, the scheme identifies the activities or the process steps for performing certification. You know, process steps like sampling procedures, what kind of testing or inspection will be performed, and by who, and how often, and where, and when. What kind of mark or certificate will be provided, and to a large extent, what kind of surveillance activities will be performed for a product, process, or service that's certified. So 17067, the general ideas stretch way back. Some of the original ideas that have been incorporated in 17067 were first captured in 1982 in an ISO book called Certification and Related Activities. The ideas were probably not brand new at that time, and so the origins go back beyond 1982. Now, this was back in a time when certification was all wrapped up inside one organization. The body, the scheme or the program used, the requirements that products were supposed to meet. It was assumed at that point in time, back in the early 80s, that all of that would be handled by a single organization under a single process. Well, ISO IEC Guide 67 was first published in 2004, and that was published concurrently with the first edition of ISO IEC 17000, the terminology for conformity assessment. And ISO IEC 17000 emphasized and defined the concept of a scheme as something separate and distinct from a certification body. And so Guide 67 was published to better explain the idea of a product, process, or certification scheme as a set of rules and procedures and as something that was separate and different from the certification body that would follow the scheme to perform certification. And in 2013, Guide 67 was turned into 17067. And 17067 was created as a companion to ISO IEC 17065, which set requirements for bodies performing certification of products, processes, and services. 17065 made extensive use of this idea of a scheme as something separate and different from a certification body. So because 17065 used that, 17067 was published as an update to Guide 67 to further explain what a scheme is and to help readers of 17065 understand the references to schemes in 17065. Now, I've referred to CASCO a couple times here. So briefly, CASCO is the ISO Policy Committee on Conformity Assessment. But even though it's a policy committee, it also develops and maintains the 17,000 series of standards. In fact, there probably is more activity in ISO CASCO related to the 17,000 series of standards, the CASCO toolbox, than activities related to ISO's policy on conformity assessment. Now, when ISO CASCO does its work with the 17,000 series standards, it follows the ISO directives just the same as a technical committee or a subcommittee would. Now, in ISO CASCO, however, there are no standing subcommittees. Now, in a TC, in a technical committee, it's common for a subcommittee to be established and for that subcommittee to take responsibility for the ongoing maintenance and revision of one or a group of standards. But that's not what CASCO does. CASCO instead establishes a working group each time a standard needs to be developed or needs to be revised. This means that a different group of experts are likely used to revise an existing standard, different from the experts that developed the standard in the first place. And we'll see the impact of this on the 17067 revision later on. So like any ISO technical committee, CASCO operates based on participating ISO national member bodies. ISO national member bodies can choose whether to participate in CASCO or not. And if they participate, they can participate as a P member, a participating member, or as an O member, an observer member. The IEC input to ISO CASCO is a little different. Each of the IEC national committees provides their feedback on ISO CASCO ballots and issues. The national IEC committees feed that up to the IEC itself. And the IEC creates a consensus IEC position or input as the input into ISO CASCO. So on the ISO side, the national member bodies of ISO feed into CASCO. On the IEC, it's the IEC itself that feeds into CASCO. Now, ISO staff, ISO Central Secretariat staff provide the CASCO Secretariat. The CASCO Secretariat is not delegated down to a CASCO national member body. And here in the United States, ANSI staff provide the Secretariat for the U.S. tag to CASCO, the International Conformity Assessment Committee that you heard David reference in the introduction there. So participation in the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, the ICAC, is the way to participate in the work of CASCO, in the development of those standards and on the issues that CASCO addresses. So CASCO standards are revised really at any time. They can be revised at any time. An individual CASCO national member body can draft a resolution for a revision of any of the CASCO standards and ask that it be balloted among all the national member bodies that participate in CASCO. And if a majority of the participating member bodies agree to the revision, then the revision starts. However, if a span of 5 years goes by and there hasn't been any proposed or approved resolutions to revise a standard, then ISO CASCO conducts what it calls a systematic review. This isn't unique to ISO CASCO. This happens in technical committees as well. And there can be an unlimited number of iterations of these 5-year cycles where a systematic review ballot is issued because there have been no proposals to revise the standard. And a systematic review allows 3 different choices among the CASCO, CASCO national member bodies. You can vote to confirm the standard; it stays exactly as it is. You can vote to revise the standard with the same scope that it has, or you can vote to withdraw the standard because it really doesn't have any more use. Now, all the members, all the national member bodies of CASCO, they vote on all the standards. Some national member bodies set up specialized subgroups to consider each individual CASCO standard when it comes up for ballot. Here in the United States, we don't do that. We as an entire committee consider each and every CASCO ballot that comes before us. Again, subcommittees are not used in ISO CASCO, so therefore subcommittees at the national member level are generally, there's nothing for them to plug into, so that's not a big encouragement for those to be established. So what's the revision history of 17067, now that we know all this? Well, it was published in 2013, and there were no proposals for revision before 2018. So in 2018, CASCO performed a systematic review ballot, and the document was voted to confirm. No changes, no revisions. And it was by a substantial majority, very, very large majority. So as of 2018, the next systematic review would have been planned for the second half of 2023. But just prior to the issuance of that 2023 systematic review ballot, a resolution was proposed from the national member body to CASCO in Germany, from DIN, and the resolution proposed to revise ISO IEC 17067. Now, how is 17067 unique? Well, at the time it was published, and even before as Guide 67, it was the only CASCO toolbox standard to address scheme owners and their responsibilities. It was the only standard to address scheme development and scheme improvement. And obviously, all of this was in the context of a scheme to certify products, processes, and services. Now, within 17067, there are 7 examples of certification schemes. 6 of those examples are schemes for certifying tangible products. The 7th, the one example, the additional example, is of an example of a scheme for certifying processes and services. And 17067 kind of goes one step further. The 6 examples that it provides for certifying products are differentiated by the kinds of surveillance activities that the examples of the schemes provide. So of all the 6 examples, there's a different set or different type of surveillance activity in each of the 6. In all the other respects, the examples of the schemes are exactly the same. Now, the 6 examples in 17067 for schemes for certifying tangible products are labeled as types of schemes. And that label over the years has come to imply that these examples are discrete categories. It implies that each of the types of schemes is unique when compared to the other types. But when you read the descriptions of each of the examples, you realize that that's not the case. There are a number of overlaps between these 6 examples of schemes. So you could have a real life scheme that could fit into more than one of the different 6 examples or types. As we will see later, this has an impact on the revision of 17067. So now we know a little bit about 17067, the way it sits today. And we know that we had a resolution that was approved, a resolution from the German National Committee that was approved in 2023 to revise 17067. So what was the impact of that resolution based on the way 17067 looks today? Well, first, the resolution to revise 17067 in effect preempted the systematic review ballot. So once that resolution was submitted, the systematic review clock, so to speak, stopped ticking. And once that resolution was approved by CASCO members, the systematic review clock was kind of put away in the cupboard, and it'll be retrieved and restarted when the revision to 17067 gets published. So the result of that is the resolution being passed basically took away the ability for CASCO members to retain 17067 in its current state. The reason for that is because the resolution that passed indicated that the revision for 17067 should expand its scope. It was not just a resolution to revise the standard and keep its current scope. No, the resolution was, let's update the standard and let's have it cover a broader scope. Specifically, the scope, the expanded scope it's going to cover is not going to result in any requirements for schemes. That's not the kind of expansion that was proposed and approved. It'll still be guidance. It won't set requirements. The expansion is, instead of 17067 covering schemes just for the certification of products, processes, and services, 17067 will now be expanded so that its scope will cover schemes for all kinds of requirements, all kinds of conformity assessment activities, and all kinds of objects of conformity assessment. Now, that's kind of a code word, objects of conformity assessment. What does that mean? Well, an object of conformity assessment is just a generic term to identify anything that fulfills specified requirements. So a product, a process, or a service is an object of conformity assessment, but so is a person, or an installation, or a management system, or a material, or a process. Well, I already said process. So the idea here is that 17067 is going to get much bigger because it's going to provide guidance on any kind of scheme that covers any kind of conformity assessment. Once that resolution was approved, ISO CASCO established a new working group. Like I said, it's not a subcommittee. It's established a brand new working group called Working Group 65. The DIN proposed and a convener for that working group in their resolution, and that convener is in charge of the working group. I'm a member of that working group as an expert appointed by ANSI, and the working group has had meetings in October of last year and January and June of this year so far. Now, at this stage of our work, I can share with you several key issues and key decisions and directions that we've identified in the working group. Because as you can imagine, we're going from a relatively narrow scope of a certain kind of scheme just for certification, just for products, processes, and services. And now we're broadening that out, and all of a sudden we've got a lot of white space to fill in. And so we've had to think hard about how can we do this in a way that will really be helpful. And the first issue that I want to talk about, and I'll talk about 3 altogether, but the first issue I want to talk about are these legacy types of schemes for certification of products and that one type of scheme for the certification of processes and services. In the current 17067, the 6 examples or types of schemes for certification of products are actually labeled, and they're called scheme types 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And as I said, they're differentiated from each other primarily based on the different kinds of surveillance activities that the scheme might describe. Now, over the years, in some countries and regions, these examples or types, as they're labeled, have been specifically referenced in legislation, regulation, contracts, specifications, and in a given situation, this kind of shorthand designation for a product certification scheme is used to describe the kind of scheme that's required or the kind of scheme that's being provided. So these references, when there's a reference in a contract or a regulation that says a type 3 scheme is required, or I'm a certification body and I operate a type 4 scheme, this was a shorthand way, really, of communicating some general characteristics, particularly about the surveillance activities in the scheme. So what happens to these types? What happens to these examples in the revised 17067? Well, the working group 65 members recognize that these play a pretty important role in various geographies, and it would cause a lot of confusion if there was any significant change to those, or worse, if they were simply taken out. And so Working Group 65, as of now, will propose and will draft a revision to 17067 that retains all 6 of the examples or types of schemes for certification of products, and the 1 example or type of scheme for certification of processes and services. In addition, there will be no changes to the designations of these examples or types of schemes. The current references, type 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, those will all stay the same so that, and they'll mean the same thing, and the descriptions will be the same, so that those references to those kinds of schemes in regulation and legislation and contracts and so forth will continue to mean the same thing. And we're not going to trigger lots of revisions to those kinds of documents by making some sort of change. So these examples of tangible product certification and process and service certification, but these examples, while they constitute a very big part of 17067 today, right? Well, 17067 is going to get much bigger. And we're going to be talking about guidance for lots of other different kinds of schemes. So this existing content will become a relatively much smaller portion of 17067 than it is today. The second issue I want to talk about that we've thought about in the working group is because we have this requirement, we don't have the luxury of narrowing down the scope of this revised document to just talk about a little bit more. We have to talk about everything. And so we were struggling with how do we provide general guidance that could apply to any kind of conformity assessment scheme? Is there anything that every single conformity assessment scheme has in common that we could use to kind of frame, right, or categorize our very general guidance? And what we found is we found that we are going to propose the functional approach, which is found in Annex A of ISO IEC 17000. We're going to use the functional approach as a framework, if you will, to talk about guidance on schemes in general. Now, the functional approach is, in effect, it's this diagram that you see on the screen here, and this is a diagram from Annex A of ISO IEC 17000. And the diagram is really an elaboration of the definition of conformity assessment that's provided in ISO IEC 17000. ISO IEC 17000 defines conformity assessment as demonstration that specified requirements are fulfilled. And Annex A of 17,000 says, well, it's not just any old demonstration. It's a demonstration that follows this flowchart. And this flowchart is very, very generic. And the flowchart is explained in Annex A of 17,000 about what the boxes and the words in the boxes mean, and so on and so forth. So while the current 17067 kind of makes a passing reference to the functional approach, it says specifically the current 17067 says that product, process, and certification schemes should implement the functional approach. There's not really a strong link between the guidance for schemes in the current 17067 and the functional approach. What we are going to do, what we're going to propose, is that we are going to provide guidance and an explanation in the revised 17067 that explains that the functional approach actually plays a much more critical and important role. In effect, the functional approach is the universal framework shared by all schemes. Now remember, the scheme description I gave you said a scheme describes the thing that's going to be certified, or in conformity assessment terms, the object of conformity assessment. It identifies the specified requirements that the object is going to fulfill, and it provides the methodology, right, or the process steps for performing a demonstration that the object of conformity fulfills the specified requirements. Well, that third element, that methodology, what we're generally going to be discussing in the revised 17067 is that the functional approach is in effect the generic universal template for any methodology for performing conformity assessment. This diagram is so general that it really does fit any kind of scheme that can be used to perform conformity assessment. Now, the third issue I want to talk about is a little bit more fundamental, and it has to do with how we as a working group have actually changed our thinking about schemes and how to provide guidance about schemes. So to start, the current 17067 uses product certification schemes right in the title. And this implies that a scheme for product certification is one type of a scheme. Now, the resolution to revise 17067 specifically indicated that we are going to change the scope, and we are going to adapt the scope to conformity assessment in general. So the working group, when we thought about this, we thought, well, all right, so the current 17067 is about product certification schemes. So that means we have to come up with guidance for all the other types of schemes that are out there. And so that's how we're going to tackle our work. We'll figure out what all the other types of schemes are, and we'll write guidance about each one. Like personnel certification schemes, or accreditation schemes, or inspection schemes, or management system certification schemes, testing schemes, peer assessment schemes, so on and so forth. And so that was the initial thought about how to approach our task of writing a much bigger document and a lot more guidance. The initial thought was, we'll have a section that provides kind of general guidance about schemes, and then that applies to every kind of scheme. And then we'll have some sections about some very specific guidance about the specific types of schemes that we want to discuss. And so as we created our working drafts, the first working draft was really just a collection of information. And when we created our second working draft, WD2, we did do exactly that. We had several clauses at the beginning dealing with schemes in general, like scheme owners, who should be a scheme owner, or what their responsibilities are, what kind of relationship should they have, general guidance about the development of a scheme, how to do that, how to involve interested parties, generally the content of a scheme. And here's where we really pulled in the functional approach to say, look, here's a great starting point, and here's all the process steps that you can consider in a general way. And the content in this part of our working draft 2 was written to be applicable to any type of schemes. Nothing in these clauses was unique to product certification schemes or management system certification schemes and so on and so forth. Instead, in our working draft 2, we created an annex for each type of scheme to provide guidance specific to that particular type of scheme. And we had 11 annexes for 11 different types of conformity assessment schemes that we came up with. And we even had a 12th annex called Other, because there are going to be some conformity assessment schemes out there that don't fit any of the other types. And so that's how we created our working draft 2. Now, an interesting thing happened. We sat back and we read this, and if you've participated in standards development, you know this phenomenon. You're in the middle of the meeting and you're drafting and you're discussing and you're figuring out what to write, and it's all making sense, and it all gets recorded, and the drafting notes get taken out, and the grammar gets cleaned up, and it gets set down on paper, and you walk away from it, and a month later you come back and you read it, and it doesn't look anything quite like what you remembered. And frankly, it looks very different. And that's what happened with our working draft 2. When we actually went back and read it as working group expert members and submitted comments on it and then discussed those comments, we reached a couple of conclusions. And one is something of a conclusion, but the second one's pretty basic, and it's important. So the first conclusion we reached was that our general clauses that are dealing with schemes in general, we found that we had used far too many clause headings, right? We had fragmented those out way too much, and we were kind of getting lost. The forest was getting lost for the trees, so to speak, and so we concluded that really wasn't necessary, and we could make it much more streamlined and use far fewer clause headings and group things together for the general guidance about all kinds of schemes. And so we made that change for our working draft number 3. But the bigger realization, the bigger change came when we started discussing the annexes. And again, we had an annex for each type of scheme, and we tried to provide the guidance specific to that type of scheme in the annex for that scheme. But when we read that material, and after giving it a little space to settle, so to speak, a little time to settle, it led us actually to be more confused and not more enlightened about schemes and about conformity assessment. The annexes, frankly, raised more questions than provided answers, and they created more confusion than clarity. And one of the primary reasons for this was while in theory we had identified 11 different types of schemes, when we read that and we thought about it in the context of the real life schemes that we were familiar with, we started to realize that the real life schemes that we were familiar with could fall and be considered under more than one annex. And I'll just give you a simple example. A scheme for product certification, right? A scheme for product certification can very commonly include testing of the product as an activity. It could include inspection of the product as an activity, as certainly, and of course, it involves the issuance of a certification, a third party attestation, a third party issuing a statement of conformity that the product has been demonstrated to fulfill the specified requirements. Well, in our annex structure, we took that real life scheme, a typical real life scheme, and we thought, oh my goodness, well, that means that the annex on testing schemes needs to apply to that real life scheme, and the annex on inspection schemes needs to apply to that real life scheme, and the annex on product certification schemes needs to apply to that particular scheme as well. And so we started to think, well, does the content of our annexes, do they play well together? Can we take all three of those and apply that to this one scheme? And we tried to do that, and it was not pretty. It was not a pretty thing. And then we started to think, well, management system certification is sometimes a conformity assessment activity that can be combined with product certification. That appears in some schemes. And now we were thinking maybe there's 4 different annexes that we would need to combine and apply to a specific scheme. And what we finally realized is that this is pretty unrealistic. If we, as a bunch of people who actually wrote these annexes, were having this much difficulty applying them to come up with the guidance for a particular scheme, a real life scheme, how in the world would we expect anybody who's not sitting around the table in Geneva, not privy to all of our dialogue and debate and clarification? If it's hard for us to apply, it's certainly not going to be very easy and probably not very productive for very many other people to apply. So we kind of had to solve that problem. And in order to solve that problem, we had to kind of step all the way back to our original assumption. Our original assumption was that the current 17067, which dealt with product certification schemes, right in the title, our original assumption was, well, that means that there are other types of schemes. Product certification scheme is one type, and then the others: management system, personnel certification and testing, inspection, accreditation, peer assessment. Our assumption was that all of those are also types of schemes. And what we had to step back and realize is that that's not really true. In effect, we stepped back and said, okay, well, what if we approach this on the assumption that there are not types of schemes? Does that make this easier to understand? And we found that it did. And so through our dialogue, and we all discussed this, because this was a real change of paradigm for all of us. But we came to the conclusion that in today's world, unlike 1982, in today's world, there really aren't categories of schemes. There aren't types of schemes. What we concluded was that the functional approach is really the common denominator among all schemes, because it expresses a generic methodology that all schemes are based on. And we concluded that you can't create a set of labels or a set of types to use with schemes, because no matter what label or what type, whatever name you try to give that, it's always in the end going to be somewhat misleading. Because schemes today, right, they're much more complex, and they are much more multidimensional. Schemes today, they already commonly include multiple objects of conformity, and they already include a lot of different conformity assessment activities that we thought we could use as types or categories of schemes. There's just so much variety in schemes out there that it's just no longer possible to create and attach labels as a type of scheme and have that actually mean anything. In effect, it's always going to be a little misleading, if not a lot misleading. So, recognizing that, we are going to propose, and we'll be very interested to see the reaction to this, we're going to propose that the guidance we deliver is now going to be structured for different types of conformity assessment schemes, which include certain characteristics. We're not going to call them types, okay? We're going to try to convey that there is just one kind of conformity assessment scheme. The one kind of conformity assessment scheme is a scheme that provides details and implementation of the generic functional approach. Now, for schemes which include for example, testing as an activity, we can say some things about a scheme with that characteristic. It's not a type of scheme, it's a scheme which includes a particular kind of characteristic. So we're going to have our annexes in Working Draft 3, but we're going to actively try to discourage the idea that there are types of schemes. So in the CD of 17067, you will not likely see or have any references to a set of types or categories of schemes that you can use to label these things. Because in our experience in the working group, we've discovered that that's a non-productive exercise. In fact, it's probably a counterproductive exercise. Creating categories makes conformity assessment and schemes harder to understand. It oversimplifies them, and it really is a misleading indication. It's too simplistic. If you want to understand a scheme, our guidance, we hope, is going to encourage you to start with an understanding of the functional approach, because that's what the methodology in each scheme is based on. And then if you want to know something about the scheme, don't just rely on a label. Even if somebody else gives it a label, hopefully the guidance is going to encourage you to actually look at the content of the scheme. So 17067 will be guidance on all types of conformity assessment schemes, right? But we're not going to provide labels. We're not going to provide a categorization system for all conformity assessment schemes. We're going to try to drive home the point that each scheme has its own details and specifics, and we shouldn't rely on labels to try to communicate that. So what comes next? Well, the working group members are actively drafting Working Draft 3 now. And after that, we as a working group will look at the words we wrote, comment on it, and discuss it at a meeting this fall. The CD ballot for the revised 17067 is expected to be issued before the end of this year. And obviously this new version, now you've had this webinar, so you've heard some of the stories, but for people who have not heard this, they're going to look at the new 17067 and they're going to see a remarkably different document, especially if they were unaware that the resolution to revise it really expanded its scope. But if they're looking for a document that gives them a set of categories or labels to put on schemes, they're not really going to find that. So if we're successful, and if we gain consensus around this approach, because we're just the working group, the consensus will come from what the national member bodies to CASCO think about our drafts as we ballot them. But if we continue in this current direction, my opinion is that we will explain schemes as the practical implementation, the practical methodology based on the generic functional approach. We'll be able to drive home the point that all schemes share the functional approach as that common basis. And therefore, 17067 will be just as foundationally important as ISO IEC 17000, and they will both be linked as sister documents through this concept of the functional approach. So that's an overview of what we've been talking about and some of the major issues. I'm going to stop talking now and turn it back over to David.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate that greatly. That was a great presentation. We've had quite a few questions come through, and we'll get to those after we discuss a couple additional resources available for accredited organizations or organizations seeking accreditation. The web, we have webcasts that are free at anab.org. Also, all of these webinars are free. They're live informational sessions that we offer monthly on a variety of topics. We record each of these sessions and we make them available on our website and through our YouTube channel. The ANAB blog page has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and many other topics. And ANAB offers live, online, in-person, and self-paced training in a lot of areas, including internal auditing, standard requirements, product certification, measurement confidence, risk analysis, etc. So at this time, we'd like to address some of the questions that have come in. Keith, one of the first questions we got was the individual would like a clarification regarding how does the 17067 standard relate to 17065? You stated that it was almost an adjunct. So is it not a standalone standard on itself?
Oh, that's a great question. 17067 certainly is a standalone standard. So let me describe the linkage between the two. 17065 has a lot of requirements for certification bodies, and in many of those cases, in many of those requirements, 17065 says the certification body shall fill in the requirement, and in many cases it goes on to say, and shall do this or that or the next thing in accordance with the scheme. So there are these references to the scheme in 17065 requirements. And when a body is accredited to 17065, part of the assessment is that the body is following whatever the scheme says, wherever that scheme is referenced in 17065. Well, the natural question that comes up, especially back in 2012 when 17065 was published, and this question keeps coming up today. Well, what's a scheme? I don't quite understand what that means and how that comes into play here, and why is it being referenced in 17065? And so 17065 is logically linked to 17067 is logically linked to 17065 because 17067 attempts to explain the concept of a product certification scheme, so that when you see that reference in 17065, you can take 17067, read it, get all that background and guidance of what a scheme is, and therefore better understand the requirement in 17065 that refers to a scheme. Now, you don't have to do that, right? You don't have to do that. So there's a logical link between the two, but they are each their own standalone standards. You can use one independently of the other.
Okay, thank you, Keith. One additional question we had relates back to early on in the presentation. You made a comment on CASCO and the participating members and the observing members. Does that mean that they vote differently on revisions?
Yeah, very good. So all the members vote, right? And this is not unique to CASCO. You can read this in the ISO directives. All the members of the committee vote, but for certain types of ballots and for certain types of votes, the P members, the members that participate, and there are obligations of being a P member. You have to return ballots and you have to do certain things. But for certain ballots and on certain votes, it's the P members that indicate what the final outcome of the ballot will be. So while everybody votes, everybody's vote can be counted differently depending on your P or O member status.
That's perfect. Thank you, Keith. That looks like that concludes our questions for today. If you'd like to get any additional information about training offered by ANAB, you can contact us at training@anab.org. If you'd like accreditation services or to have a proposal or quotation on accreditation, you can contact us at anab@anab.org. Keith, once again, thank you. A very informative presentation. That concludes our presentation today and our webinar on 17067. Thank you and have a nice day.